Thank you so much, Ahmed. It is a pleasure to be here. It's good to be back in the summit. So today what I'd like to speak to you about is actually the importance of cultivated meat and transformational innovation in the transition to resilient meat sector. But before we start with that, I thought I'd give you a few slides about Aleph. So Aleph is an Israeli-based company, and we cultivate beef steaks. I'd like to mention maybe a few things that kind of stand out and make us a bit more unique. Number one is that we are cultivating structured steaks, as opposed to mincemeat. This technology comes from the Technion, which is the Israeli Technology Institute. Second is that we do not use any GMO cells, and we actually really put a lot of focus on what our consumers really are expecting and helping them to adapt to this emerging industry. So we work a lot with chefs, and we focus a lot about culinary and sensory aspects within our food. The third is that we are developing a technology that can really reduce the cost of producing cultivated meat, and also with the opportunity to scale up. And the last is that we have incorporated sustainable practices from the inception of the company. And that is with the focus, and we've already incorporated sustainability in the design of our process and the design of our facilities, and even in our go-to-market strategies. A few interesting milestones. So Aleph Farms was we were built in 2017, but we created the first cultivated steak. Our proof of concept was in the end of 2018. Currently today, we're already building our pilot facility and planning on a soft launch by the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, and coming out commercially fully by 2025. On the middle picture, you can see that we were also the first company to cultivate meat in space in the International Space Station. That was back in 2019, and we're actually planned to cultivate the second time in the International Space Station in the beginning of 2022 with our Israeli astronaut. We're actually not a company focused on the space sector, but we have explored the space sector, and really understood that we share mutual goals regarding our sustainability aspects. We're very interested in creating food that is in areas where you have scarce conditions with very little resources in closed loops. And these are things that are really kind of, for us, something that's very important for us, that we can provide food anywhere, literally anywhere, to anyone at any time. And that's something that kind of helped us create our space program called Aleph back in 2020. The last is our picture on the right, where you saw earlier this year, maybe you've all seen this, but we've announced our rib eye steak. This was the work that was done together with the Technion. This is an additional product that we're coming out with, but it is still under R&D. It shows different technologies, and it kind of shows how we have achieved a proof of concept to the Holy Grail, which is the ribeye steak. So we're looking forward to it, and this is kind of where we're taking it in the future. The last slide I wanted to talk about is specifically about Aleph Farms, is about our sustainability commitments. We have a very comprehensive sustainability strategy and efforts, but one of the things that we've already come out with the commitment is back in 2020 is that we are planning on becoming the first carbon neutral meat company by 2025. That means that in 2025, our operations scope 1 and 2 are going to be carbon neutral, and by 2030, fully carbon neutral throughout the whole supply chain. So this is an audience that knows very well the meat sector, but it's clear that we can't continue as business as usual. We see on one hand that there is an increase in global meat consumption. The population is growing, the consumption is growing, new markets are entering the meat sector, and we are really seeing a growth of this market to achieve $1.8 trillion annually by 2040. And on the other hand, we know that there's a direct impact of the meat sector on different aspects that are really impacting our life. So on one hand, we know that the meat sector has an impact on climate change and biodiversity loss. And I'm not going to get into the details because I think they're clear. On the second hand, we know that there's a public health crisis because of the meat sector. Has to do with aspects of zoonotic diseases that can either impact the animals themselves, impact the workers, or even impact the fact that we are using a tremendous amount of antibiotics, which is creating a lot of antibiotic resistance, which can harm the population and our public health. And the last, and we really saw this with COVID, is that when that if our supply chain isn't resilient and we're showing where there's these hotspots that are broken, we're increasing our food insecurity. So on one hand, and we saw this in 2020, on one hand, we had meat factories shut down and cattle were just thrown away. And on the other hand, we saw a major increase in the people that are suffering from hunger and malnutrition. So what we know is that we need to look at this and find a solution for the meat industry. But there's not, one thing that we understood is that there's not one solution that can solve this food system crisis. And we need to look at it and think about a multi-stakeholder, holistic and collaborative approach. And what we kind of came up with is these 6 components of a more inclusive solution. And I wanted to share it with you today. So the first is responsible consumption. Meat plays a meaningful role in culture and global traditions. Its nutritional composition is important for the human diet. It affects growth as well as physical and cognitive development. Meat is a primary source for full, complete protein, but it also has an invaluable source for minerals and vitamins such as zinc and iron and vitamin B12 and more. And we also know that the consumption varies between the regions and the cultures and the traditions, and it can range from an annual consumption of 5 kilos per capita in India, all the way to an overconsumption in the global north, such as Australia and the US, with an annual consumption of over 100 kilos per capita annually. Now, the recommended meat intake varies between the different national and international organizations of food and health. And I'm not the one who's going to tell you what is exact recommended intake. But I will say that we need to adapt a healthier diet. And that includes that the global north needs to have a more reduced and responsible consumption, not only of red meat, but also of salts and sugars and fats. And we need to increase our plant-based foods that are fresh and unprocessed, such as fruits and vegetables and legumes, nuts, and whole grains. The second component is that we need to adapt agricultural methods that can really give back to our climate as much as it takes. We need an agricultural system that can protect the climate and the biodiversity. And this is what we look at when we look at regenerative agriculture. This can reduce pesticide use, it can mitigate our climate change, and it can create resiliency throughout our supply chain with flood and drought resistance, for example. There are challenges with the regenerative agriculture. There is a need of a systemic approach to support farmers in this transition. And it also is initially costly and time consuming. And lastly, it needs a little bit more support on a scientific aspect where we need to have a better definition, a clear standardized definition of what it means to be a sustainable agriculture method with quantified data supporting these practices. Even though we know already that they're beneficial, we need more evidence to support it. And when we look at incremental innovation, we also know, when we look at regenerative agriculture, we know that it can be supported by incremental innovation. And I'm going to talk about 2 types of innovation in this presentation. And it's important to differentiate them, but it's also important to understand that they're both critical for the overall solution. So incremental innovation is actually here to improve, it's innovations that are here to improve an existing product or process, but help it be more efficient, more sustainable, more productive, and even give it a competitive differentiation. And this can be, for example, soil monitoring or measuring systems or software solutions for livestock management. But all in all, it's here to support the regenerative agriculture. Our third component, which is actually talks about a different type of innovation, is our transformational innovation. So we know that regenerative agriculture, as much as we want to move towards it, there is their capacity of the production that they need to create for the growing population is limited. Because definitely when we have that growing demand of food in general and meat specifically. So we need to find solutions that can close that gap between that limited capacity of production versus growing demand. And this is where transformational innovation can enter. And transformational innovation talks about structural, integrative, and systemic changes. These are usually processes that need multi-stakeholder multi-stakeholders taking part in working in a long-lasting economic and social impact. It really to transition to more sustainable approaches of production. It's also important to understand that we need to also preserve to some limit the values and preferences and strategies of the different societal groups. So when we talk about transformational and innovation, alternative proteins is one of these examples. And when we look at alternative proteins, we can divide it into two major approaches, two major categories. The first are the meat analogs, and that can be either plant-based, fermentation, algae, insects. All of these are here to give a real alternative to the actual meat. And in recent years have really have increased their technology to really be very similar in taste and flavor and texture to actual meat. The second approach is cultivated meat. And here we're actually not talking about an alternative to the meat, but we're talking about an alternative to the process. So we're growing real meat, but we're doing it in a completely different process. And when we look at these cultivated meat, we know that when we're comparing it to the conventional ways of producing beef, not regenerative ways, cultivated meat has the opportunity to reduce in a massive way the climate impact, the environmental impact of meat production in general. So it can reduce by over 90% pollution reduction, land consumption, it reduces by over 90% pollution in land consumption and even carbon footprint. It does mean that we still need to incorporate sustainable practices within our cultivated meat, but all in all, it has that potential to reduce our carbon footprint by over 90% of conventional beef production and almost 80% of water reduction. Our fourth component is all about just transition and social justice. And here it's really important to understand that we have the meat sector supports 1.2 billion people throughout livelihood of the sector. So we know that when we're entering transformational innovation and we're looking at this transition, we need to make sure that as we're looking and taking care of our climate, we're also taking care of the people within it. And that's something that we need to put a lot of emphasis on, and how we build our strategies that is giving value to the people within the sector itself and making sure that they can still continue in providing for their families. The fifth component is the 4 pillars of sustainability. And this is something where Aleph Farms is also incorporating our sustainability strategies, incorporating what these 4 pillars, but we also believe that this is something that we need to look at when we're looking at the full global meat sector. And it talks about the 4 aspects, these 4 pillars. The first is the environmental aspect, which is looking at climate and biodiversity and natural resources, and understanding that we need to make sure that we are producing food and keeping our nature in balance. The second aspect of the 4 pillars is a social pillar, and that is talking about how we're promoting the people and the local communities and how we are acknowledging the sociocultural needs. And it talks a lot about how we can work together with farmers and ranchers to support the food system on one hand, but also their livelihood on the other. The third pillar of sustainability talks about health and how the food system needs to be part of what we call sustainable diets. And sustainable diets don't only talk about how we need to be sustainable on an environmental aspect, but we also need to be sustainable for our bodies and make sure that we're eating healthy and maintaining a good diet and a good nutritional diet. And the last pillar is the economic aspect of sustainability. And that talks about how sustainability needs to be a driver of growth. This is not a nice to have thing. This needs to be a proven business model. And also we need to make sure that on one hand, we're creating nutritious food that's affordable, but on the other hand, we're also incorporating the true cost of food. And if that means to incorporate externalities, we need to start working on that as well. And the last component within the economic sustainability is really building the trust back in the consumer. And that means that we need to create resilient supply chains, and we need to be more traceable and more transparent, helping the consumer understand where their food is coming from. And this kind of shows that these 4 pillars of sustainability need to apply on all levels of society. So it can go on a personal level of how I want to be in my own home and in my own company, but also looking at it in a regional ecosystem, and then also looking at it as a fully global economy. So we need to look at all 4 pillars of sustainability as we're moving forward and trying to promote and transition our food system. Our last component actually talks about policymakers and building our future today. So we see that there are the Paris Agreement that came out with lots of carbon commitments and how people are now becoming more carbon neutral, or at least aiming towards becoming carbon neutral. And we need to make sure that cultivated meat and transformational innovation, this is all part of the solution towards that. We also need to understand that the younger generations are really driving a consumer demand and a cultural shift. And they are demanding to be more, they are showing that they want to be more responsible in their consumption. They're demanding to know more about how their food arrives to their plate. And for that, we need to make sure, and this is something where policymakers can support us, we need to make sure that we are, as food systems, as food companies, that we are accountable in providing that education to our consumers. And that can be in multiple ways, but for an example, it can be through labeling, through a labeling system that can show more information about our food system and what's coming, so they can make these choices on their own. Whether they want to have an impact, where they can make a choice if it's important for them that this food is eco-friendly or carbon neutral or non-GMO or any other kind of example. So just to sum this up, our meat sector and food ecosystem needs to support food security. And when we talk about food security, we're looking at how we can have a continuous accessibility of food for everyone in the world. And when we look about accessibility, we look at it in 3 levels of accessibility. First of all, accessibility and pricing. We need to have affordable food that can be, that everybody can afford. We need to have nutritional accessibility. So we need to make sure that the food that is affordable is also nutritious. And last is that we need to have a resilient supply chain where it has a continuous capability of delivering food everywhere. And that kind of needs to be the umbrella of how we kind of motivate ourselves as building our food systems. So just to sum this up, the inclusive solution we talk about is 6 components. It talks about responsible consumption. It talks about sustainable methods of agriculture, such as regenerative agriculture, supported by incremental innovation. It talks about how transformational innovation can complement this regenerative agriculture. And that can be already where cultivated meat enters in alternative proteins. We need to make sure that we are incorporating a just transition while we are doing this transition, and making sure that there is social justice and making sure that we're taking care of the people. The fifth is policy and regulation, talking about educating and helping and supporting food systems be more accountable on how to educate consumers. And the last is the four pillars of sustainability, talking about how everybody needs to incorporate different aspects of looking at how to create a resilient and sustainable ecosystem. Thank you.